It was a poignant moment as U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry watched the same three Marines who lowered the flag in 1961 hand off the flag to three current Marines to raise it again outside the U.S. Embassy in Havana. The embassy officially reopened on July 20th when diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Cuba were formally re-established. On that day, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez raised his own country's flag at the reopened Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C. Secretary Kerry is the highest-ranking U.S. official to set foot on the small Caribbean island in 70 years.
The establishment of normal diplomatic relations is not something that one government does as a favor to another. It is something that two countries do together when the citizens of both will benefit. And in this case, the reopening of our embassies is important on two levels: people to people and government to government.
Joining us now from Havana is Carlos Alzugaray. He's a Cuban diplomat and educator. Also with us is Mark Weisbrot. He's the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Ambassador Alzugaray, let me start with you. A big day in Havana, the reopening of the U.S. Embassy. But you have said that the restoration of relations between Cuba and the United States is seen by many officials in Havana as simply a change of U.S. tactics. The fear is, as you've pointed out, is that this is still about regime change. What do you believe are the true U.S. intentions?
Well, I think there is an ambiguity here. Obviously, Secretary Kerry coming to Havana to raise the American flag at the American embassy is a signal that the United States is serious about having an engagement with the Cuban government. And that, I think, is the right line, and it's welcome in Cuba. Initially, Barack Obama said that it was a change in tactics, but more and more, the political discourse from Washington is, well, listen, we are going to have a normal relation with the Cuban government. So obviously, there is a contradiction there. You don't attempt to overthrow the government with which you are dealing. So I see signals of movement in the policy that are let's say, that are nice or that are good, that are going the right direction. But still, there is the problem of the subversive activities, the programs to undermine the Cuban government, which are there still.
Mark, what is your view on what is happening in Cuba right now? Is this about regime change, or is the United States looking at something else here?
Well, I don't think you have a real change in policy towards it. You know, it isn't just Cuba, it's Latin America. One of the reasons why President Obama did this is he was told very clearly at the summit of the Americas before the last one that there wouldn't be another summit without Cuba. And so you've had this sea change in Latin American hemispheric relations. The whole continent has become much more independent of the United States and formed new international institutions and everything. So this is part of it, and the question is really, is this a change in U.S. policy towards Latin America? And I don't really see it yet. I mean, first of all, you have, you know, in March, the U.S. government, the White House, instituted sanctions, economic sanctions against Venezuela. Now, they walked back from that as part of this negotiation with Cuba. I think the Cubans sent a message that if they want to normalize relations with Cuba, they have to normalize relations with the rest of the hemisphere, too. And you still don't have diplomatic, full ambassadorial relations with Bolivia either. And why is that? It's because the U.S. refused to tell the Bolivian government what it's spending its millions of dollars inside Bolivia on, which of course is and has been efforts to undermine that government as well. So yeah, I think the strategy is still regime change. For all the left governments in Latin America, the U.S. hasn't really, there's no real acknowledgement in the U.S. government. And I say, you know, it is complicated because you have the White House, but the White House didn't trust its own State Department, for example, in negotiating with Cuba. They didn't tell the head of the Western Hemisphere, Roberta Jacobson, about the negotiations with Cuba until 3 weeks before it was public. You know, after more than a year of negotiation. You have the Pentagon, you have 17 intelligence agencies. So is Obama prepared, President Obama prepared to take on all of this part of the foreign policy establishment, the Congress and everyone else too that wants to, you know, the Republicans who don't want to get rid of the embargo? I don't see that kind of a commitment. He's got his embassies open, he's got his legacy, And whether it goes further, we really don't know.
So is it more symbolic than anything else what we're seeing right now?
So far, but you know, that doesn't mean that, you know, it can't change. I mean, sooner or later, the United States government as a whole, the whole foreign policy establishment, is going to have to recognize that there's a new reality in the hemisphere. They can't just get rid of governments they don't like. And of course, they've recognized for 20 years that the policy towards Cuba has been a complete failure. So that's a historic change in that sense, that recognition. But whether they're really going to change their policy towards Latin America and recognize the new reality that these are independent countries in general, and you can't just try and get rid of the ones that you don't like, I don't see that yet.
Ambassador, getting back to the events of Friday in Havana, we hear some very careful language being used here. The opening of the embassy is being described as a government-to-government event with limited space. There are going to be no people outside of Cuban officials who are going to be attending this flag-raising ceremony, but Secretary John Kerry, Secretary of State John Kerry, will meet later with people described as political dissidents and opponents, and that will take place at a separate reception. How will that be seen in Havana?
Well, Secretary Kerry and American diplomats can meet anyone who they like. The difference here is financing their activities. So technically, the issue of meeting with them is not a big problem. Giving them such a high profile is a big problem, of course, and it's not a nice gesture. But well, things are not going to change overnight. We hope, I think the Cuban government and everybody in Cuba hopes that the United States keeps out of Cuba's internal affairs.
Mark, the opening of this embassy in Havana, will it change the lives of ordinary Cubans?
I don't think it would necessarily, no. I mean, it's not going to increase necessarily U.S. influence there. So the Cuban government has its own, you know, economic program, and I think they're going to follow that, and they'll decide, you know, how much more tourism they want, any kind of economic changes they want, and the U.S. having an embassy there, I don't see that really changing that.
Ambassador, the New York Times reported on Friday morning that the U.S. is trying to, and these are the words of the New York Times, strike a balance by working with what the newspaper called an authoritarian government and at the same time supporting Cuba's beleaguered dissidents. Do we know at this stage what kind of access the Americans will have to anybody in Cuba?
They can have access to anyone. Here again, the issue is, what do you want that access for? Do you want that access to get better informed of what the situation is in Cuba? Then great, have all the access you want, including that part of the Cuban society that is not the government and it's not the dissidents. There are hundreds of civil society organizations in Cuba, or organizations like the one I work for, the journal Temas. We have a position. We are not part of the government. We support socialism in Cuba. But we are critics of the Cuban government when we think the Cuban government has not done the right thing. That's one thing, and U.S. diplomats will do way, as any diplomat in every part of the world, talk to everyone. But the problem up till now is that the United States defines civil society only by those people who oppose openly the government and want to change the government towards a capitalist society. Now, there are people who hold that view in Cuba, and that's fine. And that's not a crime in Cuba. That's not a crime in Cuba. But cooperating with a foreign power to overthrow the Cuban government, that's a crime. And if an American diplomat is engaged in that, he's going beyond his diplomatic status. So that's the point. That's the point. Of course, it's symbolic to a certain extent that Secretary Kerry is making it a point of meeting these people. Is he doing it because he's under pressure from Senator Marco Rubio and the rest, and he has to balance it? Okay, I think what is happening here is that the priority was the raising of the flag ceremony, and that was only a government-to-government activity.
Mark, this is how the Washington Post is describing the restoration of relations between Cuba and the United States. It says the Obama administration's decision is banked on the belief that the U.S. can do more to encourage change on the island through a soft power strategy of engagement. Is that what the U.S. is doing?
I think so, and it's certainly, well, again, when you talk about the U.S., like Carlos just mentioned, is Kerry doing something to placate the right wing in Congress, okay? So that's the foreign policy establishment we were talking about, you know, the Congress, the leaders of Congress, the 17 intelligence agencies, the Pentagon, the State Department, and I would include the media here as well, which is the Washington Post, and that's what the Washington Post is. You know, their editorial board is kind of neoconservative. And so, yeah, they just see this as another means of regime change, and there are many people within this foreign policy establishment who see it the same way. So President Obama, again, he has proved to be very tenacious when he really wants something. Like, if you look at the negotiations with Iran and the agreement with Iran, he's taking on the most powerful lobbies, some of the most powerful lobbies in this country, and all kinds of people in order to get this done. But I don't see him caring about Latin America in the same way, that he's going to really, and even if he did, it's going to take some years to change this foreign policy establishment that for you know, more than a century has seen itself as having the right to get rid of governments they don't like, and sees the, as John Kerry himself unfortunately said not that long ago, Latin America as its backyard.